For next time, you're going to be reading the excerpts from the Gorgias by Plato. So we're going to be moving on from stuff that's specifically about education to stuff that is concerned with language and rhetoric next time. And the second exploratory reflection is going to be due a week from today, next Tuesday, right? So ignore whatever it says in Georgia View. It's going to be due next Tuesday. I will adjust that to make sure everything is okay. So does anybody have any questions about assignments? So essentially what you're doing for exploratory reflection 2, right, everybody understands, is you're doing the same thing you did for exploratory reflection 1, right? But you're applying it to one of the 5 essays that we've read over the past week and a half, right? So you can do it on Sun Tzu, on Seneca, on Douglass, on Anzaldúa, or on Martha Nussbaum. So you can pick any one of those 5, and yeah, you're otherwise just doing the same thing you did for the first one. All right, everybody good? All right, great. So then let's just take a quick minute. I know this might seem a little tedious, but I think it is helpful to go back and review the previous 4 essays. So what do we remember about Sun Tzu's theories of education?
Get a teacher.
Yep, get a teacher. Right, you cannot improve, according to Sun Tzu, without a teacher, right? Good.
Make use of resources.
Make use of resources, yes. Don't just stand on your tiptoes, climb that mountain. What else?
Environment matters.
Your environment matters, yes, surround yourself. In particular, with people who are going to help you achieve your goals, right?
Conscious activity.
Yes, and that education is a matter of conscious activity. And is this conscious activity over the long haul or the short haul? Long haul, right? Over a lifetime, right? According to Sun Tzu, you're never really done. Okay, what about Seneca? What do we remember about Seneca?
Reason over emotion.
Yep, reason over emotion. Right? Use your reason to control your emotions.
Cultivation of wisdom.
Yes. He's concerned primarily with the cultivation of wisdom. And what does he mean by wisdom? What is wisdom to Seneca?
Living with what you can't change.
Yeah. And this is why we learn to control our emotions, right? So that we don't flip out when there's a situation that we just can't do anything about, right? And what does education have to do with any of this? What style of education does Seneca think is completely useless?
Professional studies.
Yeah, vocational professional studies are pointless to him, right? And even what we call the liberal arts is only any good as a stepping stone to wisdom, right? Right. He says that they don't teach you wisdom, but you can learn wisdom without them. Okay, Frederick Douglass.
Education is freedom.
Yes. In his case, quite literally, right? There's in the metaphorical sense where, learning to read frees his mind from the confines of his master's home, right? And learning to write literally frees him from bondage when he's able to forge his own paths, right? What else do you remember about Douglass?
Difficulty of obtaining education in lower classes.
Yes. That it is more that someone from his class can't take this for granted, right? He's writing for people who likely would be taking literacy, for example, for granted. And he has demonstrated that no, if you're not sent to school, this is actually a long and difficult process, right? He's in his teens before he knows how to write. Not for lack of trying. What else do you remember about Douglass?
Just abolitionist.
Okay, yep. Abolitionist. What else? I heard somebody saying something else a second ago.
Self-taught.
Yeah, he is self-taught. He has no teacher, right? He has to obtain everything on his own, right? So he is also then exemplifying Sun Tzu's principles of making use of resources, right? But also defying Sun Tzu's principle of getting a teacher because it's not possible legally or socially for him to get a teacher, right? Now, what about Anzaldúa? What do you remember about Gloria Anzaldúa from last time?
Tongue equals language.
Yep. And language is very closely connected to identity, right? So tongue equals language equals identity. What else do we remember about Anzaldúa?
Education was oppressive and liberating.
Yeah, education can be oppressive or liberating, right? Depending on how it's done, right? So educational systems seem to enforce conformity, right? Like, remember, for example, the way she's punished for speaking Spanish at school and for correcting her teacher when her teacher mispronounces her name, right? The way she's punished when she's a teacher for giving Chicano novels to students in her classes, and the way she has a hard time finding a PhD supervisor who will work on Chicano literature with her, right? So, yeah, so educational systems seem to enforce conformity, but it seems to be possible to find freedom by bucking those systems, right? Anything else in particular we remember about Anzaldúa and about her arguments? I think, yeah, the important takeaway here is the focus on identity as a kind of hybrid thing, right? As something you build, that you cobble together out of a number of different linguistic and cultural features and attitudes, right? And that this is, this for her is a good thing, is a positive thing, and kind of enforcing conformity is bad. Okay. So let's then see where Martha Nussbaum compares to these others. What did you guys think of this essay? What seems to be her basic argument? What does she seem to think is good, and what does she seem to think is bad?
Like, she was saying that education can either help or hinder democracy in a way, because
Okay.
people were using education to promote economic growth, but it made a greater gap between like prosperity and like poorness. Like,
Okay.
economy and stuff like that.
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of binaries embedded there. Right? On the one hand, like the title of the essay itself is a binary, right? You know, we got for profit versus for democracy. And economic growth versus, how do we want to phrase that? Maybe like human development or human flourishing or something like that?
Something like that.
And I would argue that there's also, I think, embedded, not just in the article, but in sort of what you said about it there a second ago, Carrie, a simple versus complex binary as well, right? What is the problem, according to Nussbaum, with focusing education on economic growth? Is that it necessarily leads to inequality? Does focusing on education for economic growth have to lead to greater inequality?
Not necessarily. I think
Yeah,
you're saying they focus too much attention on one or the other.
yeah, it doesn't have to, right? But the problem is, at least as Nussbaum argues, right, that if you're looking at economic growth as the only measure, right, you're not looking at how that growth is distributed. And so you think everything is peachy keen, hunky-dory as long as things keep growing, right? You're not worried about where that growth is concentrated. And I would argue that this is actually kind of a live issue in our politics right now. I mean, like this essay is only a couple of years old. I think it's 2010, I think. So it's about a decade old. And some of the information is already a little bit out of date. For example, she talks about the BJP party in India being out of power at the time she wrote the essay. They're back in power now. But I think, yeah, the basic idea is one that we're still talking about, is one that kind of still shapes our electoral politics, right? One of the biggest problems I think that data-driven political consultants have is that they tend to look at aggregates and averages. And if on average things look like they're going well, they imagine that they must be going well everywhere, right? But they're not looking at how things are going in specific places, right? So if you look at an old steel mill town where industry is mostly dried up or gone someplace else, right? Say, you know, someplace like Youngstown, Ohio. Or, you know, an agricultural community that is, you know, barely keeping things together because prices for crops are too low. You know, even, you know, someplace like right here, right? Now you compare these to big cities or big metro areas with thriving tech industries, right? You take someplace like San Francisco or New York, and if you're averaging economic prosperity in San Francisco and New York and Youngstown and Americus, right? It's going to flatten out and everything's going to look like it's okay, right? Because you've got extremes on either end. But you're not looking at the specific data about any of these places. And you're also not delving into inequality within some of these places, right? Like one of the big problems prosperity has caused in San Francisco and New York, right, is that there's so much opportunity that's concentrated there, right? In certain fields, you have to move to some of these big cities in order to get a job, but it's become so expensive that no one can afford to live there. So, these are some of the issues that kind of like runaway growth and focusing only on growth doesn't deal with, right? Now let's look at how Nussbaum approaches this problem when speaking specifically about education. So I want you guys to look first at the beginning of the essay, page 48, and I want you to look over the 3 quotes that she's got there. They're, from the first is from the U.S. Constitution. The second is from the Constitution of India. And the third is from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is a United Nations document. And I want you to think about what these 3 documents, or what these 3 quotations have in common with each other. What do they seem to share? And why do they make an effective lead-in into this argument? Just have a look, think about them for a minute, and speak up when you have an answer. Think about what each of these quotes might have to do with education.
I say all 3 promote the education towards the people to
Okay.
help society.
Okay, so these are all focused on social goods and social goals, right? Rather than on the individual good?
Yeah.
Okay. But there are individual goods, kind of like, like there is like, things like respect for difference, right? Kind of embedded in all of these. For example, if we look at the preamble to the Constitution of India, right? We, the people of India, have solemnly resolved to secure to all its citizens justice, economic and political, liberty of thought, expression, belief, faith and worship, equality of status and of opportunity, and to promote among them all fraternity, assuring the dignity of the individual and the unity and integrity of the nation. So there's a lot of language here that stresses unity within a framework of individual rights, right? That society, it's more a society plus individual kind of argument rather than a society versus the individual kind of argument, right? Now, what about the preamble of the U.S. Constitution? Does this work the same way? To form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, to ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Does this sound like it's more focused on the individual or on the collective?
On the collective.
Yeah, which is weird for the US, right? Because one of the things that, we're always told about American culture is its stress on individual rights, right? This is, one of the things we see, the arguments back and forth in the courts, things like that, right? But the preamble to the Constitution is very much focused on the idea of the common good, right? What's good for all. And, while it does talk about the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity, right? Otherwise, it's not really, at least this preamble isn't saying much about individual rights. Now, what is a preamble? Meant to be a statement of. Why does a constitution have a preamble? What does the preamble of a constitution state? Think about this in terms of what the introduction of a paper is supposed to do, right? What are you supposed to do in the introduction of your paper?
Background information, like a thesis.
Okay, yeah. Background information and a thesis, right? So you're stating your basic argument, right? So essentially what you're doing in your introduction is telling your audience what the goal of your paper is, right? This is what I want to move towards. And the preamble of a national constitution is a statement of goals, right? It's a statement of ideals. Right, so this is what we're aiming for, right? This is the big thing that we want. And then we're going to get into specifics. But in both cases, or with both of these constitutions, how much does either of them have to say about economic growth as a goal?
The first one pretty much just says a general prosperity, doesn't really specify anything.
Yeah, promote the general welfare is the closest it gets to talking about economics at all, right? And yeah, I think one thing we have to remember too is that's 1787, right? So this is a period in which modern economic theory is in its infancy anywhere. They do mention justice, economic and political in the Indian Constitution, right? But note, right, that's not in the context of growth, right? That's justice, economic, and political, right? So that's essentially that everybody should be treated fairly by the justice system and by the economic system, right? So it seems to be a statement of fairness rather than a statement of promoting growth. Now, if we look at this quote from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, education shall be directed to the full development of the human personality and to the strengthening of respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. It shall promote understanding, tolerance, and friendship among all nations, racial, or religious groups. Does this strike you as substantially different from the two preambles? Why or why not?
Policy is different in the sense that in the Declaration of Human Rights, it's only really talking about the human flourishing aspect.
Okay, yeah.
Anything about, I guess, the nation or economic growth.
Yeah, for one thing, we're talking here, I think that's actually a good point, is that we're not talking about the goals of a specific nation or a specific government here, right? This is a supposed to be a global document, right, that it refers to all nations cooperating. There is really kind of no reference to economic anything, right? The sole purpose here of education seems to be human flourishing, human development, right? So, if we're just looking at these three quotes, before we even start getting into the essay, knowing what the title is, Education for Profit, Education for Democracy, which side of the argument do you think this essay is going to come down on?
For democracy.
Yeah, this is tipping its hand in that direction pretty clearly, right? That's what's more important. Because the stated goals of those two constitutions and of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are much more concerned with this than with this. Okay, so why do you think she chooses as her example nations the US and India?
I think it's like to show the contrast between like an older democracy and a new democracy. Like,
Okay, yeah, the current Indian government has only been in existence since 1949, right? So, yeah, we are talking about a young constitution, you know, a young democracy, if not a young nation, right? Whereas in the US, we are talking about an older democracy. So yeah, some of this is certainly get founding dates, right? 1787 versus 1949. What else is different about the way these countries developed historically that might make them instructive for these possibilities?
I mean, the U.S. is like a global superpower, and I wouldn't say India is underdeveloped, but like in terms of like
Yeah, I mean-
structure, it's not the same as the U.S.
India is actually a rising power right now, right? India has been on the rise, economically in particular, for a good couple of decades now. But yeah, we are talking about an established global superpower, really, versus a rising power, right? By 2010, this would be clear. But think about the population makeup of both countries as well. Where, at the very least, did the ruling class of the United States originally come from?
Britain.
Yeah, so the U.S. is a settler colonialist society, right? Or is built out of one. Whereas India is built out of the rejection of a settler colonial society. So Britain was India was from some point in the 17th century up until 1949, largely ruled and administered by various British government officials, right? So India is what we call a post-colonial nation. So different experiences of development there. Right? So one nation that is basically founded by the settlers, another that kicked the settlers out and is then ruled by the native population. So there are a couple of interesting differences between the US and India that make them interesting kind of test cases for what Nussbaum is talking about, right? They are also they're comparable in that they're both democracies. And that they are both, to some extent, multicultural. In fact, she talks about even differences between the way education is administered in different Indian states, right? That in Gujarat, for example, the education system is quite different from the education system in the state of Kerala, right? So, let's get into the kinds of arguments here that she is making in favor of education for democracy. And I think this first bit we've already covered a little bit. To think about education for democratic citizenship, we have to think about what democratic nations are and what they strive for. What does it mean then for a nation to advance? In one view, it means to increase its gross national product per capita. The measure of national achievement has for decades been the standard one used by the development economists around the world, as if it were a good proxy for a nation's overall quality of life. So first off, let's focus on the question that she raises here. So there are actually two questions she raises in this paragraph, right? What's the first one that's kind of embedded in the first sentence? It's not phrased as a question, but there's a question implied.
What are democratic nations?
Yeah, what is a democracy, right? Good. And then what's the second question that is asked?
What democracy is strive for?
Okay, what is democracy? What should it strive for? And then after that?
What does it mean for a nation to advance?
Yeah, what is advancement, right? So so she's giving us the two big questions she wants to deal with here in this first paragraph, right? What is democracy and what is advancement? And then she's starting to offer what the current standard definition of advancement is, right? That it's equated with economic growth by most economists. Right? The goal of a nation, says this model of development, should be economic growth. Never mind about distribution and social equality. Never mind about preconditions of stable democracy. Never mind about the quality of race and gender relations. Never mind about the improvement of other aspects of a human being's quality of life that are not well linked to economic growth. Empirical studies have by now shown that political liberty, health, and education are all poorly correlated with growth. One sign of what this model leaves out is the fact that South Africa under apartheid used to shoot up to the top of development indices. There was a lot of wealth in the old South Africa, and the old model of development rewarded that achievement or good fortune, ignoring the staggering distributional inequalities, the brutal apartheid regime, and the health and educational deficiencies that went with it. So why does she cite South Africa here as an example of economic growth as a bad indicator of democracy or of a nation's overall health?
I feel like it's just a more extreme example that's going to grab people's attention.
Okay, yeah, it is an extreme example. And why is it an extreme example? Like, what's going to grab people's attention about it? What do we know about South Africa historically? About the way the government there was run prior to Nelson Mandela becoming president. Do you guys know what apartheid is?
It's like pretty much segregation, right?
Yeah, apartheid is an Afrikaans word that is so like South African Dutch dialect that means apartness or separateness. And all citizens in South Africa were classified according to their racial origins and had to carry around a card that stated exactly what their race was. And they were ranked according to level of privilege, right? So at the top were white people, below them were people of mixed race, below them were Asians, and below them were black Africans. So people were extremely limited in where they could go what jobs they could take, their access to education, right? And this was all kind of like brutally enforced by an arguably democratic government operating under a constitution, right? It's just that only one group had control of that government and of the writing of that constitution. So what she's saying here is like, despite the fact there was a good deal of economic growth in South Africa because it was resource rich, life for most people in the country was pretty terrible a lot of the time, right? That economic growth doesn't correlate well with freedom or with quality of life necessarily for the average citizen. Because it matters where all that wealth is going, right? How many of you have ever heard the phrase trickle-down economics? Does anybody know what this means? Sort of, kind of.
It's not like there's like the wealthy few at the top that get most money and growth, and that kind of like trickles down to like middle class and like lower class.
Yeah, I think it's usually I think the term that economists usually use for it, I think, is supply side economics. Because the idea is that if you give the suppliers of goods more money, then they will invest that money in increased capacity or whatever, right? We've been trying some version of this in the US for some 40 years now. Yeah, the basic idea is that you give either tax breaks or economic incentives, whatever, to the wealthiest people in a nation, and this is supposed to encourage economic growth, right? And she actually references this directly a little bit further down, page 49. Right, proponents of the old model sometimes like to claim that the pursuit of economic growth will by itself deliver the other good things that I have mentioned: health, education, a decrease in social and economic inequality. Basically, that all that wealth will trickle down, right? By now, however, examining the results of these divergent experiments, we have discovered that the old model really does not deliver the goods as claimed. Achievements in health and education, for example, are very poorly correlated with economic growth. Nor does political liberty track growth, as we can see from the stunning success of China. So producing economic growth does not mean producing democracy. Nor does it mean producing a healthy, engaged, educated population in which opportunities for a good life are available to all social classes. Still, everyone likes economic growth these days, and the trend is, if anything, toward increasing reliance on what I've called the old paradigm, rather than toward a more complex account of what societies should be trying to achieve for their people. So what is she trying to sever here? Like, what two ideas is she trying to uncouple from one another? What does she think what two ideas does she think people are attaching to each other that shouldn't be attached?
Like growth with equality?
Yeah, but economic growth has really nothing to do with democracy, right? That the fact that a country's economy is humming along very strongly is no indicator that there's any meaningful democracy there, right? So yeah, so she's arguing here that, yeah, economic growth and democracy are not related, right? They don't correlate. The problem here is that the way she wants to account for these things is, as she says, like more complex, right? Looking at things in terms of economic growth is relatively simple because there's only one indicator you have to look at, right? Doing things a different way is naturally going to be harder. So let's look at the way she sees the economic growth model affecting education. Like in particular, the way it affects history curriculum. I think this is actually a pretty good example, right? So there are big arguments right now in U.S. politics about the way history should be taught. What are people arguing over in terms of the teaching of history. What's the conservative argument and what is the liberal or left argument about the teaching of history? Is anybody familiar with any of this? Yeah, go ahead, Carrie.
So, I know more of like the conservative side, they want history to be taught in like more of a nationalist way, like painting America as like in a really good way.
Okay, yeah. On the conservative side, yeah, the idea is to promote a positive idea, a positive notion of American history, right? All right, to focus on achievements rather than deficits, right? Places where we have fallen short of our stated ideals, or places where we have not, as a nation, been an unqualified success, right? And so then what's the argument that is opposed to this?
Well, the more liberal side is just kind of like painting our mistakes and like teaching those mistakes throughout history so people learn from them.
Yeah, the other side of this is a more kind of warts and all approach, right? It's not necessarily about downplaying or erasing the idea of achievement, but it is about showing that, mistakes have been made historically. So it's about pointing out difficulties and critically analyzing history. Now, I'm not, coming down on one side or the other about this, right? I'm not a historian, I'm not a history educator. From my speech mannerisms and general attitude, it's probably no secret how I vote, right? But I'm not trying to push anybody in any particular direction either way here. Which of these ideas do you think Nussbaum would be more supportive of, and why?
The more liberal side, because it's more honest.
Okay.
And it talks about the inequality and stuff that she's talking about. So I feel like it will lead people to make those changes in the future.
Yeah, and I mean, her entire premise is largely that what education needs to do is prepare us to critically analyze issues and learn to make good choices through analysis, right? So because this particular process involves more analysis, and more independent thinking, as opposed to the other approach, which is mostly about learning facts and dates, right? Yeah, go ahead. That this would be the approach that would better prepare people to participate in a democratic society, right? To be able to compare opposing points of view, to be able to weigh different arguments, rather than learning facts and dates. And I think that the problem that she would have with this, I would say, is less about politics and more about process, right? That if what you are being taught is to largely kind of uncritically accept a set of facts, you're never really thinking about those facts. Or at the very least, you're not encouraged to think about those facts, right? we could probably compare this to what Gloria Anzaldúa had to say about, her experiences in school, right? That, questioning the teacher was wrong. Introducing things that were not part of the standard curriculum was wrong, right? What was encouraged was a kind of conformity. And think about kind of your own educational experiences. How many of you went to public high schools? Okay, most of you. So what did you usually have to do at the end of each year to prove you'd actually learned shit?
Like, big test.
Yeah, a big standardized test, right? And this has been the way American education has been trending for about the last 20 years, right? So, I remember when I had just graduated from college, the debate over the No Child Left Behind Act, and the way that was going to enforce accountability in schools by holding schools accountable for standardized test results, right? So what kinds of things are easy to measure on standardized tests?
Just fact recall.
Yeah, fact recall, basic math skills, things like that, right? What sorts of things that are hard to measure on a standardized test?
Critical thinking and analysis, because it's more subjective.
Yeah, I mean, that's the sort of thing that you largely kind of work out, in, say, literature and history classes and essays, right? And in your math classes, things like that by doing things like proofs, right? I remember, when I took geometry in high school, we had to do proofs, and there was more than one way to get the right answer, but it was important that you showed your work and not just that you filled in the right bubble, to show that you understood the process, that you understood at least one of the ways you could get to that answer, right? And so I think that's part of the problem that she's pointing out with standardization, right, is that it doesn't encourage analysis, it doesn't encourage critical thinking. Let's look specifically at where she talks about how this works. Bottom of page 53 here, right? What about the arts and literature, so often valued by democratic educators? An education for economic growth will first of all have contempt for these parts of a child's training because they don't look like they lead to personal or national economic advancement. For this reason, all over the world, programs in arts and the humanities at all levels are being cut away in favor of the cultivation of the technical. Indian parents take pride in a child who gains admission to the Institutes of Technology and Management. They are ashamed of a child who studies literature or philosophy or who wants to paint or dance or sing. American parents, too, are moving rapidly in this direction despite a long liberal arts tradition. Now, this seems to me like a kind of broad brush to paint all parents in both of these countries with. But, pardon?
That is true.
But it's true? So let me ask you guys this then. How many of you were encouraged by your parents to major in something practical that would lead directly to a job? Okay, so that's at least two of you, right? The secrets that I'm going to share here is that, by and large, unless there is a specific job that requires technical training that you want to do, it doesn't actually matter that much what you major in. Major in whatever you like. If all you are looking for is an entry-level white-collar office job, all that matters is that you have a bachelor's degree, by and large, right? It doesn't really matter that much what specifically you majored in. So just major in something you like. But educators for economic growth will do more than ignore the arts. They will fear them. For a cultivated and developed sympathy is a particularly dangerous enemy of obtuseness, and moral obtuseness is necessary to carry out programs of economic development that ignore inequality. It is easier to treat people as objects to be manipulated if you have never learned any other way to see them. As Tagore, that's Rabindranath Tagore, the Indian poet and novelist, said, aggressive nationalism needs to blunt the moral conscience, so it needs people who do not recognize the individual, who speak group speak, who behave and see the world like docile bureaucrats. Art is the great enemy of that obtuseness, and artists, unless thoroughly browbeaten and corrupted, are not the reliable servants of any ideology, even a basically good one. They always ask the imagination to move beyond its usual confines, to see the world in new ways. So educators for economic growth will campaign against the humanities and arts as ingredients of basic education. This assault is currently taking place all over the world. So she does actually introduce another binary. There's another binary that's in here that we haven't really quite discussed. And I think that it's embedded in that difference that one of you, I think that Kyle noted about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and those two constitutions. What's that other binary at work in here?
Okay.
We're looking right now at page 54. What's one of the things that Nussbaum seems to fear standardized education leads to?
Like sheeple.
Okay, like sheeple, yeah. People who don't really think for themselves, who are just going to continue to, they'll go in whatever direction they're pointed, right? She also has a lot of concerns about nationalism, right? And I think that one of the things that she opposes, one of the ideas that she opposes here, right, we've got this nationalism versus globalism binary, right? Seeing yourself solely as a citizen of a nation rather than seeing yourself as a global citizen. And I think that's why she puts that paragraph from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, at the beginning of the essay, in addition to those two constitutional preambles, right? That, she wants to split these two off from each other, right? Thinking of yourself solely as a citizen of a nation rather than thinking of yourself in world terms and global terms, right? And look, like all of these binaries can be questioned, right? What we're trying to produce right now just is a sympathetic reading of Nussbaum's argument. So, what does she think we ought to do about this then? So clearly she favors education that prepares people for democracy and for independent thinking, right? So what do we make of this list of recommendations that she offers at the end, right? These are the skills vital for democracy. I want you to just sort of take a quick look at this, think about it, and tell me what you think of this list. And perhaps, what things the items on this list have in common with each other, right? How they're related. try to relate these items on the list to some of these broader concepts we've been talking about, right? See what you can do with them.
I guess I think she's just saying, like, you need to be able to critically think and be able to see everything from everyone else's perspective around you and how it's going to affect each person individually.
Okay, and I think that's the idea of being able to look at things from different angles and from different perspectives, I think, is probably one of the key elements here, right? Yeah, one of the important elements of critical thinking, one of the things that we are supposed to be trying to inculcate in you on the university level here, right, is this notion of looking at things from a variety of perspectives, right? So this is one of the reasons, even like in this course, we're looking at the same issue from a variety of different historical and national and philosophical traditions, right? And we see some places where they kind of map onto each other, right? There are definite similarities, but there are also places where the comparisons fall apart, right? But yeah, so this notion that different perspectives are worthwhile. Now, how might we relate that to citizenship in a democracy? What do you need to be able to do to participate in a democratic society? Yeah, I mean, voting is part of it, right? And you thus have to be able to weigh the arguments that different candidates and parties make their cases, right? But I think part of the argument she's making is that if you've done this kind of very standardized, regurgitating facts-based kind of education, then you will probably just sort of glom onto a particular party, uncritically accept whatever the positions of that party are, and then simply vote in accordance with that, right? What do you need to do? What do you need to be able to do to participate in a meaningful, good faith debate with another person who disagrees with you? Without things getting violent or nasty.
You just need to keep an open mind and understand their perspective
Mm-hmm.
and be able to explain your perspective as well.
Yeah, so you've got to be able to argue for your position, right? But you also need to understand what their position is, where it's coming from, and also that they are another human being, right? I think this is something that, and I'm just going to pontificate here slightly a little bit. I think one of the reasons social media arguments tend to get so nasty is because it's really easy to turn that name and icon, right, into an abstraction rather than a real person. I just, had a really vicious argument on Facebook a couple of days ago with a guy I went to high school with. I don't know this guy anymore, right? We haven't spoken to each other in 25 years. And the first thing that he says to me in a quarter century is, a criticism of something that I posted on my page. And the point I tried to make to him is we don't know anything about each other anymore, so we can't really have the kind of good faith back and forth dialogue that is kind of necessary here, right? All I know is that you're some asshole who just tried to flame my page, right? You know. I may have fond memories of you from high school, right? But we're not those people anymore, right? And if you can't envision the other person as a real human being in a real context, right? It's really hard to hold your temper and not just get pissed off when they disagree with you, right? And I think, this is where we find a connection with Douglass here, right? One of the things that Douglass is doing, Douglass is writing for an audience that, may be sympathetic to his basic political arguments, right? But he wants them to understand what his life has been like as well, right? So that they know where these arguments came from, and they understand the perspective from which he's arguing, and what he had to overcome to get to where he was, right? So I think that's kind of the big deal here, is that kind of recognition of common humanity. And that's really hard to do when all you've learned is kind of lists of facts and figures that you regurgitate out for profit. Okay, so we're going to stop there because I can see that everybody's tired and I'm tired. And we'll start cleaning up. I'll let you go.